Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum and a very good morning. On behalf of Islamabad Policy Research Institute, I welcome you all to today's webinar titled Citizenship Amendment Act 2019 of India, Discriminatory and Exclusionist, both for Muslims and other minorities. Today's webinar will feature a keynote address to be delivered by Dr. Ramesh Kumar Vankwani. Dr. Ramesh Kumar has been a member of the National Assembly since 2013. He is also the founder and serves as the patron-in-chief of the Pakistan Hindu Council. Unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, he's running a little late and we'll accommodate him and his address when he does arrive. To commence the webinar, I would invite Acting President IPRI, Brigadier Rashid Wali Zanjua, for his introductory remarks. Over to you, sir. Sir, if you could unmute your mic, please.
Okay, thanks, Wali. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I welcome all the distinguished panelists who have joined us to discuss today's topic. And we are hoping to have Ramesh Saab with us in a short while. And I'm positive that today's session is going to contribute significantly to our understanding of an issue which has been of great concern to Hindu minorities as well as the Muslim minorities. After winning the elections in 2019 with a bigger majority, Bharatiya Janata Party has been on a mission to promote its extremist ideology even more vociferously. The main motivation behind this has been to change the secular character of India as envisioned by Nehru to a majoritarian Hindu polity. This is being achieved with the introduction of laws which are communal, majoritarian, and intolerant in nature. One such law is the Citizenship Amendment Act 2019, enacted with the purpose of providing citizenship to religious minorities, except Muslims from India's neighboring countries. With almost a year since it was passed, the Citizenship Amendment Act has met with acute criticism and protests within India. Internationally too, United Nations bodies have been critical of the communal nature of Citizenship Amendment Act. Moreover, rather than providing refuge to non-Muslims from other countries, the act has become a source of violence and discrimination for Hindus and Muslims alike. Recently, there have been reports of around 28,000 Muslim Pakistani Hindus stranded at Jodhpur, waiting to return to Pakistan. There have been reports of murder of 11 Pakistani Hindus in Rajasthan too. Such a situation warrants an objective analysis of the impact CAA has had on minorities as well as Hindus in India and the implications it could have for regional countries. To be able to shed light on this, Islamabad Policy Research Institute is organizing a webinar titled Citizenship Amendment Act 2019 of India, Discriminatory and Exclusionist, both for Muslims and other minorities. To hold a candid discussion, all the speakers are encouraged to come up with their original ideas, and objective is to capture these ideas and then use them for policy relevant briefs so that some of those ideas could find resonance amongst the policymakers. Now, India, as we know, has been on a quest to revise the history, and it is revising the history both for Muslims as well as Hindus. There are minorities in India like Dalits who have been at the receiving end of these atrocities. And Modi administration has sedulously nurtured a narrative of exclusivism. National Register of Citizenship and the Citizenship Amendment Act both are acting in sync to deny minorities their due rights. Now, this exclusivism, it bodes ill both for Indian national integrity and cohesion. which is a thing the Modi administration needs to understand. And instead of understanding the basic ideas that gel the nations together, the centrifugal tendencies are being encouraged. There's a scholar called Zoyant who has given a model. According to that Zoyant's model, those countries or nations that revise their history based on elite ideology and domestic politics always lead to a conflict and discord which rips apart the fabric of the society. So we hope that the Zionist model does not apply in the long term to the subcontinent, and the peace which is held hostage to a very exclusivist ideology finds some space. The win-win formulation can only occur if all the minorities and their rights are respected, both across the border. The treatment meted out to Pakistani Hindus who landed at Jodhpur, and then there were attempts to use them for purposes for which they were not ready, and some of them got murdered also. So this is a grave human rights violation, and Indian government is persisting in its obduracy, and we hope that the act strikes a chord amongst the international bodies who should take cognizance of this and censor this Indian act. The Hindu minority in Pakistan, which has always been welcomed here, is also quite riled up, and it is very instructive to know that protests were launched, rallies were conducted to protest against the Indian high-handedness, not by the mainstream Muslim majority, but those patriots which constitute the Hindu minority in Pakistan. With this, I hand over to Waleed to introduce the panelists and start with the proceedings. Thanks, Malik.
Thank you, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, we have the distinct pleasure of having Dr. Ramesh Kumar who have joined us. Welcome, sir. We look forward to your keynote address. Can you hear me, sir? Dr. Ramesh, am I getting across to you, sir? I think we're having some technical difficulties, and while we sort those out, please let me commence with the webinar. Ladies and gentlemen, we will commence now with the working session of the webinar, and we are delighted to have with us three distinguished guests to speak on the political, regional, and legal implications of the Citizenship Amendment Act. Our first speaker is Mr. Muzzammil Ayyub Thakur, who serves as the director of the Justice Foundation, Kashmir Institute of International Affairs. He will be speaking on the topic Citizenship Amendment Act, since enactment, a win or a misfire. Our second speaker for the session is Dr. Salma Malik. She is an assistant professor at the Department of Defense and Strategic Studies, Quaid-E-Azam University, and will be speaking on the topic Impact of Citizenship Amendment Act in South Asia, exacerbating existing regional fault lines. Our third speaker is Mr. Oves Anwar, who serves as the director of the Conflict Law Center at the Research Society of International Law. Mr. Oves Anwar will be speaking on the topic, the legal implications of the Citizenship Amendment Act and analysis. I'd like to remind our participants that you may send us your questions directly on the IPRI host account. While you do send in your questions, please identify yourself and the institution that you're associated with. I would also request all members of the audience to keep sending in their questions during the course of the presentations and not necessarily towards the concluding presentation. I would now request today's first speaker, Mr. Muzzammil Ayyub, to deliver his talk on the Citizenship Amendment Act, since enactment, a win or a misfire. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity offered to me, particularly on this theme. What I'm most interested in is the root cause of the CAA and explore the path India has taken to get to where it has from the perspective of someone from Indian-occupied Kashmir. Now, it's unquestionable that the Citizenship Amendment Act is indeed discriminatory and exclusionist for both Muslims and minorities in India, but I must emphasize that this is irrelevant to Kashmiris. And as a Kashmiri, I can state with authority that we don't identify, nor are we by any stretch of the imagination Indians. However, Kashmir has always been India's laboratory, where they have experimented with various versions of oppression and subjugation whilst continuing their illegal occupation. It's never mattered which political party was in power, the Indian state have always maintained a singular policy on Kashmir, which by now should be obvious and apparent. But there is more to India's policy. Using Kashmir as a testing ground for more than 70 years, the Indian government finally exported its trials to mainland India in the shape of the CAA and the NRC. And although the CAA bill was passed in 2019, the principle itself predates the birth of India. And those principles manifested in Kashmir over 7 decades on an extreme scale, leading to war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, genocide, and demographic change. Recently, a report was published that India have already issued 400,000 domicile certificates to non-Kashmiris so that they may permanently reside in Kashmir. The demographic change, ethnic cleansing, and settler colonial project is in full swing. So much so that it took Israel 50 years to do what India have done in less than a month. Which brings me to the current BJP government, headed by Narendra Modi, backed by the RSS, a parent organization of the BJP, a radical, neo-colonial, right-wing fascist group that have an expansionist program and aspire to create a pan-Hindu nation under one party, as they believe they are a superior race. If that sounds familiar, that's because it is. Not just familiar, but identical to the ideals of Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler and his cronies. Identical to the extent that the RSS's literature is inspired by Hitler and Nazism, and even pays homage to them. The RSS uniform is inspired by them. The RSS salute is inspired by them. And the RSS vision too is inspired by them. Their expansionist vision called Akhand Bharat goes as far as the Middle East, to the extent that they claim the holy Kaaba in Mecca as their temple, referring to it as Makkeshwar Mahadev temple. What can you expect from such people who call the Taj Mahal as Tejo Mahalaya temple, the Qutub Minar as Vishnu Stambh temple, and of course the controversial and now demolished Babri Masjid as Ram Janam Bhoomi temple, also known as the Ram Mandir. On a side note, I want to mention that the foundation laying of Ram Mandir happened on the 5th of August 2020, exactly a year after India illegally annexed occupied Jammu and Kashmir. The symbolism is apparent and was purposefully done. There is no coincidence. First, they abolished the Kashmiri identity, and then they laid the foundations of the Hindu identity over the ashes of the Muslim identity by destroying that masjid. And it's not just the identity of those they consider lesser mortals that they want to diminish, but eliminate anyone that does not bow down to them, submit, or convert. We've seen numerous mob lynchings all over India, the threats of digging up dead Muslim women and raping them, concentration camps in Assam, and of course, cold-blooded murder. I remember the case of Quaid-E-Azam in India, where the 11 accused of tying him up, beating him mercilessly, and filming it while forcing him to say Jai Shri Ram and Jai Hanuman. He was married for 6 weeks before he died of his injuries. Another Indian Muslim called Afrazul was hacked to death, chopped to pieces by Shambulal Regar while live streaming it all. What's worse is that he was later bailed by the BJP to campaign for their re-election. Which leads me to the fact that there are terrorist training camps running all over India, and not just for adults. They train them young. They instill this sick ideology and mentality in them early, which can only be described as brainwashing, because I cannot believe that the human race, even Indians, are born with such thoughts. Yet in Kashmir, we have seen things that cannot even be described as human rights violations, because that term does no justice to what the people have gone through. And as I have mentioned before, the terms we use are war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, genocide, and now sponsored by the BJP and RSS, a settler colonial project to force demographic change. But this isn't new. As I have already stated, Kashmir has been a testing ground by India for decades, and that laboratory experiment has now expanded as a policy in mainland India. This is where Kashmiri Muslims' frustrations come to boil, because we've been warning the Indian Muslims, as well as the minorities, for years, and they watched what happened to Kashmiris, yet they remained silent, criminally silent. Now, the arguments that minorities in India, including Muslims, had to be careful for their survival is a weak argument, if not a false argument. And I say that because the people of Kashmir for more than 70 years stood firm in the face of oppression, subjugation, and occupation, despite the crushing force of the Indian army, the draconian measures of successive governments, and little to no international coverage. There's a modern saying that everything is made in China, but courage is made in Palestine. That same courage resides in every Kashmiri, proof of which is in the blood we have spilled defending ourselves and protesting for other nations and peoples brutalized, even being killed for. And just out of as a side note, I'm reminded of the Palestinian intifada, well, the rise of the intifada that happened several times. And several years back, there was an air raid by the Israelis. And the only person in the world that was killed for protesting for the Palestinians was a Kashmiri. And here's the thing, you see Indian Muslims stand for Palestinians. They support the Uyghurs. They condemn the atrocities in Syria. Yet for some reason, Kashmir is a stumbling block for them. And they mostly turn a blind eye. And here's the irony. Despite the lack of historic or present support from Indian Muslims, we as Kashmiris still unconditionally stand in solidarity with them against the barbarity they face. And the reason I use the term unconditionally is because those who lend their support, no matter how big or small, always seem to come with terms and conditions, not just limited to the Muslims, but all Indians that are anti-fascist. They'll condemn the human rights violations, yet still maintain the rhetoric that Kashmir is an integral part of India, which goes against the UN resolutions. And here I have to clarify that the protests we had seen in India post-CAA and NRC, where slogans of Azadi reverberated throughout the country, were slogans of Azadi within India. They still believe in their constitution and in their nationalism and in their identity as Indians, whereas Kashmiri's call for Azadi is completely and utterly different. We want Azadi from India, not within India. Ultimately, what I'm saying is that I sympathize, empathize, and stand in solidarity with the Muslims of India, including other minorities, but I want to remind them that they had seen a lengthy preview for 70 years of what was to come. And here are a few case studies of what they saw and what Kashmiris had to experience. Torture centers, where unimaginable forms of cruelty were meted out, stories of electrocution, pliers used to pull nails, rollers used to flattening roads were used on legs, salt and chili were poured into wounds, detainees were held in cells with hungry rats, forced to consume their own urine and worse, and many faced sodomy. Channel 4, a famous British channel in the United Kingdom, in 2012, reported about Qalandar, who was made to eat his own flesh after having his legs being amputated. The New York Times on the 15th of September 2019 talked about the abductees that were tortured in mosques with the loudspeakers turned on to instill fear and terror in the population. And that was my hometown. The Quint on the 13th of March 2018 talked about 5-year-old Nasir, who had a needle puncture his left eye and then sand poured into it by the Indian Armed Forces. The Guardian on the 22nd of September 2010 talked about Samir Rah, who was caught by the Indian military, thrown to the floor, a lathi or a long stick was shoved down his throat so hard and so far that his front teeth were broken, and then killed by the army boot stamping on his throat. The Police Project reported on the 15th of November 2018 excerpts of testimonies from the victims of rape and gang rape in Kunun Pushpura in 1991, where one case comes to mind of Tamanna, 9 months pregnant and gang raped, only to give birth 3 days later to a son with a broken arm. 18-month-old Hiba, probably the youngest victim of pellet guns, permanently blinded in one eye while sitting in her mother's lap just a couple of years ago. Even journalists are not spared. They are interrogated, arrested, and even have cases lodged against them, such as Fahad Shah, Ghazi Shibli, Gohar Gilani, Pirzada Ashik, Masrat Zahra, and Asif Sultan. And speaking of Asif Sultan, he has been in jail for more than 2 years, and he left at home a 6-month-old baby daughter when he was arrested. Today, she is 2.5 years old and she barely recognizes her own father. And more recently, my friend Babar Qadri, a vociferous lawyer, was killed in his own home in front of his own family. There are millions of cases like these, and even worse. India have time and again broken international law, the United Nations resolutions, and the Geneva Convention. And in fact, Genocide Watch issued an alert on Kashmir on the 15th of August 2019. Bear in mind that in October-November 1947, nearly 250,000 Kashmiris were massacred and tens of thousands forced to migrate, as reported by a London newspaper. But what can you expect from a nation whose army chiefs lament that protesters use stones instead of guns, as it would be easier to justify killing children? Or of the army major who screams on an Indian news channel to continue using rape as a weapon of war in Kashmir? Or of political leaders directing their supporters to dig up the graves of Muslim women and rape them? Or of a terror accused being supported and winning a parliamentary seat? Khushwant Singh in his book, The End of India, wrote, "Far from being Mahan, India is going to the dogs. And unless a miracle saves us, the country will break up. It will not be because of Pakistan or any other foreign power that will destroy us. India will commit suicide, or harakari, the Japanese version of suicide." In 1990, the RSS had over 1 million members, who included, among others, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, a former Prime Minister of India, L.K. Advani, a Deputy Prime Minister of India, Murli Manohar Joshi, and Uma Bharti. The last three names were charged with the destruction of the Babri Masjid on the 6th of December 1992. And of course, we know that Narendra Modi presided over the program in Gujarat. Now, the RSS was and is anti-Muslim, anti-Christian, and anti-left. It could be dismissed as a lunatic group as long as it remained on the fringes of mainstream politics, but not anymore. Its political offshoot, the BJP, had only 2 MPs in the Lok Sabha in 1984, only 2. And in 1991, they had 117. And now this same party rules the country. And I should point out that there are many other Hindu organizations more militant than the RSS, such as the Shiv Sena, the Bajrang Dal, and the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, to name a few. In conclusion, the CAA and the NLC and any other laws prior to them or those that will come after are inevitable. We know the game plan. It's not like they've hidden it in the shadows for no one to see. And in fact, they proudly flaunt their agenda, and they win elections on the back of potentially illegal and draconian acts, which I'm sure that Dr. Salma, Malik, and Mr. Oves, Anwar can clarify on. Unfortunately, we don't see enough action by the world community to end Hindutva terror, and instead we see standard responses to a crisis as described in the satire of Yes Minister. Stage 1, nothing is going to happen. Stage 2, something may be going to happen, but we should or we can't do anything about it. Stage 3, maybe we should do something about it, but there's nothing we can do. And stage 4, maybe there was something we could have done, but it's too late now. I end with a reminder, it's not too late. India have crossed a line and have gone so far beyond that they've set a new benchmark of criminality and turned their own voters into fanatics. Remember that Germany was a literate nation and yet succumbed to the most irrational sort of racial prejudice. India is largely illiterate, and it's much easier to sway the masses by arousing their basest instincts. When the Holocaust happened, the world said never again. When the Rwandan genocide happened, the world said never again. When the people of Srebrenica were ethnically cleansed, the world said never again. The days of colonialism, imperialism, and fascism should be over. And I hope that the world community intervenes to stop the further annihilation of Kashmir, Kashmiris, and minorities in India by the hands of radicals under the terrorism of Modi, the BJP, and the RSS. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for such strong words. I will now request Mr. Oves Anwar to deliver his talk on the legal implications of the Citizenship Amendment Act and analysis.
Thank you very much. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I'd like to thank Muzzammil Ayyub for the very powerful statement that he made.
Sorry to interrupt. Should I upload your presentation on the screen?
In just a second, I'll indicate that. So this discussion that I'll be today is looking at the Citizen Amendment Act of 2019 that India has passed, which the BJP government has been promoting for quite some time. It's been part of its manifesto, but as we've seen over the years, the BJP government, the RSS-inspired Hindutva ideology that is manifest in this majority government of the BJP, this has been a policy that they've had for a very long time. And what we've seen is through their manifestos and through the actions that they're taking, they've really hardened their stance and specifically targeted Muslims again and again. Just recently, their 2019 manifesto specifically says that, without taking the name of Muslims themselves, but has specifically said that time and again they have been, and by they mean Muslims, have been exploited by the ISI and its jihadi front organizations, as well as local terror cells, to carry out bombings and provide logistical support to foreign terrorists. And therefore they have to be targeted. And therefore actions have to be taken against this Muslim. I mean, this is the quintessential bigoted language that you use. This is Islamophobia as clear as it gets. And to think that a mainstream political party in India would be using such language in its manifesto is simply unbelievable. This was in its 2009 manifesto, and it's only hardened since. So what I wanted to discuss was how state machinery is being used. One, you have your legislation, and that's easy to understand. It's also easy to criticize. But then what you have is something known as system criminality. And Muzzammil, Ayyub certainly hinted at this and discussed this, but I wanted to go into a little more detail on what system criminality really is, and I'll discuss that in my presentation as well. So if you could please upload the presentation. So we'll begin by looking at some of the legal implications. What exactly is the Citizenship Amendment Act, and how it works in tandem with the next slide, please. And how it works in tandem with the National Register for Citizenship, the NRC. So essentially what the Citizenship Amendment Act looks at is that it allows a path to citizenship for Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, Jains, Parsis, and Christians belonging to Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan who have arrived in India, either as refugees or as some other category, before 31st December 2014. Now, you'll note that Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan are Muslim majority countries. The reasoning behind the BJP coming up with these laws was that all three of these countries have Islam within their constitution, and by definition, that means that Hindus are persecuted in these countries. There is very little evidence that this is actually the case. Bangladesh, their own high court, their own Supreme Court has taken Islam out and referred back to completely secular principles of the 1972 Constitution of Bangladesh. And we see that Pakistan has also provided a lot of support to Hindu minorities within its country, as well as other minorities within Pakistan. But what we see is that some justification is being used here, and it's not to protect members of these particular religious minorities, because we see that Tamils who are Hindus from Bangladesh, from Sri Lanka, they are not afforded this opportunity. We see that Buddhists from Tibet are not afforded this citizenship, and we see a number of other entities, minority groups who are not being afforded this. So the first time ever that citizenship is being granted on the basis of religion. And this is contrary specifically to India's secular credentials that it claims. And of course, Muslims very tellingly are excluded from the law's remit. Part of the BJP's recent moves to further marginalize Muslims and create a Hindutva nationalist state, this has been stated again and again, and they have normalized their Islamophobia by being a mainstream group, and they've been very successful in this. In that, as was referred earlier, there has been a brainwashing, because it is extremely difficult to imagine that Indians would be born with such prejudices. But they have certainly appealed to the worst factors in Indian society. And all societies have tendencies for conflict and tendencies for bigotry. And the job of the state, or the entire purpose of the state, is to hold these in check and to suppress such entities from being able to manifest their bigotry. But what happens when the state itself becomes this bigoted entity, or when it wins an election, a popular election? In any case, moving forward, the CAA has been challenged in the Supreme Court, and there's been a number of resolutions that have been passed against this within India itself. There is a lot of opposition to this, but then again, there's a lot of support to it as well. Next slide, please. So just to give you an idea of how this NRC process works, the National Registry of Citizenship, this is a this was very early on, a national registry was created where all the citizens of India, their names would be produced within this. So to be a member of this, you have to show documentation. And if you can show documentation, you're a legal citizen, there's no problem with that. Documentation could be, your birth certificate or the fact that you have identification documents. But what we need to realize is that India itself is an informal country, and that in a lot of cases, you will not have documentation to prove that you are an Indian citizen or that you've lived here for a very long time. So while we think that this is applying to refugees, religious minorities belonging to the Hindu, Sikh, Jain, Buddhist, Christian, Parsi community, it actually is targeted specifically at Muslims who are even Indians for generations, merely because they cannot prove, because of lack of documentation, because it's such an informal country, informal economy, informal community. Just by not having those documentation, you will be considered an illegal person. Now, an illegal person, the only way to citizenship then, if you can't prove that you have the documentation, is through the Citizenship Amendment Act. So you have to show proof of your religion. And what we see now is that Muslims from Rohingya or Afghan nationals who've come there are now converting. I mean, are converting to Christianity or to other religions just to be able to fit into this. Now we can imagine that the human rights implications of such a thing. So once religion is shown, and if you can show you're a member of one of these communities, then they determine where you're from. And if you can show that you're from Pakistan, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, then you become a legal citizen. If you're from anywhere else, you're an illegal person, you lack any right, and you can be deported. And if you're a Muslim, you're automatically taken out of the list and you are an illegal person, maybe deported. And of course, we've seen massive detention centers, some of the largest in the world being developed and who have come online, in fact, in Assam and elsewhere. Next slide, please. So what we can see here is, what I wanted to look at now was how the Citizenship Amendment Act, under India's own domestic law, under its own constitution, how it violates that. And then I'll look at how it violates international law very, very briefly. So Article 14, equality before the law. The state cannot discriminate between persons through state action, including by passing any legislation. And this is what we see here. There is no equality here. We are specifically targeting a community based on their religion. And it only permits reasonable and non-arbitrary classification of persons. Now, religion is not one of those categories. The Amendment Act, the Citizenship Amendment Act, discriminates against Muslims by extending citizenship only to non-Muslims of the three countries. And the former Chief Justice of India, R.M. Lodha, stated that exclusion based on religion may not satisfy the touchstone of constitutional provisions. Now this is, remember, a former Chief Justice. I'll get later to how the Supreme Court of India has become a partisan entity and is no more the bulwark of justice and constitutional freedoms that it used to be. Next, please. Next. Article 21, the right to life and liberty. Again, this is being violated, and we can see here, I won't go into more detail in this because I want to cover some more, but there are a number of cases of the Indian Supreme Court that clearly show that the provisions of the Citizenship Amendment Act are in violation to stated law in India. And then, of course, secularism in India. This is something that simply cannot be accepted. And we have a number of cases by the Indian Supreme Court in the past that has looked at secularism, looked at how religion cannot be mixed with any secular activity of the state. And encroachment of religion into secular activities is strictly prohibited. And what we see that the Hindutva agenda is precisely to do this. Next, please. Yes, so some of the international responses have been very, very harsh. We can see that the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has termed this to be fundamentally discriminatory. This is not Pakistan saying this. This is not anyone else saying this. This is the United Nations chief human rights entity. And it stated that the amendment will have a discriminatory effect on people's access to nationality, while all migrants, regardless of their migration status, are entitled to respect, protection, and fulfillment of their human rights. And this is not happening under the CAA. The United States Commission on International Religious Freedoms has even considered imposing sanctions, not just considered, has recommended sanctions to the US government, which should be imposed on the Home Minister, Amit Shah, who has been the principal proponent of this, as well as other leaders of India. And that the act is a dangerous turn in the wrong direction. Next, please. the ICJ, or the International Commission of Jurists, similarly has strongly criticized this particular amendment because of its religious underpinnings. Next. You can keep on going, fill up the whole slide, please. Thank you. So what we have is the international essentially what international human rights law, the clarification that you get is from the Human Rights Committee. And when they explain particular rights, they do so in general comments. So general comment number 15 of the Human Rights Committee is that by not extending equal protection to all persons, including Muslim migrants from Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, India would be in violation of its international human rights obligations. Again, one of the highest bodies of international human rights law in the world. The ICCPR, which is the fundamental basis of international human rights law, it is part of the International Bill of Rights, is completely being violated, especially the right to life, the prohibition of torture, and a number of other things because of all the implications that flow from the CAA, for example, extraditions or deportations or expulsions to other countries that will ensue because of this. And the detention camps in Assam, which are indefinite detentions essentially, that is something that again violates arbitrary deprivation of life or the prohibition against that and the prohibition against deprivation of liberty. Next, please. Could we get the next slide, please? Again, I won't go into more details, but the International Convention for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the third convention, this, even though it's on racial discrimination, but if such discrimination is coupled with discrimination based on nationality or ethnic origins, it is clearly a violation. It is considered to be racial discrimination as well. And what we see here is that particularly Bangladeshi origin or Bengali Muslims are being targeted here. So that is an ethnicity-based and nationality-based discrimination that is taking place. We see that other minority groups from, say, the Tamils of Sri Lanka or the Buddhists from Tibet, they are being discriminated against because they're not being afforded the same rights here. And the obligations to uphold the security of person, again, this is a requirement of Article 5B of the Third Convention, and various other rights under Article 5C, D, and E are all being violated by this. And you can see on the slides how deprivation of citizenship or making individuals stateless can be quite problematic. Next, please. So what we also have under international law is a customary obligation to refugees of non-refoulement. Non-refoulement essentially refers to the obligation on states which requires them to protect individuals and not return them to a country where they can face the threat of irreparable harm, some form of persecution from which they are fleeing. Now, in the context of Rohingya Muslims, and there are thousands of Rohingya Muslims who have entered India and are seeking asylum or seeking shelter there from the atrocities that we are well aware of that are taking place in Myanmar. And because of what India has already taken decisions to deport these individuals back to violating those rights. And again, because they will not have protection under CAA, they will be sent back. The other issue is statelessness, which I've already referred to. Making an individual stateless is in complete violation of international law, and people cannot be stripped of their nationality willy-nilly. Yet this is exactly what the NRC and the CAA does, and there are millions. I'm not talking about a small figure. These are millions, potentially tens of millions of individuals who will be rendered statelessness if the law is brought into effect. Next, please. And of course, once you start having these millions of individuals who are going to be rounded up, put in detention centers, or forced into deportation to places where their lives are at risk, I mean, the entire purpose of being a refugee is fleeing persecution. And if you are going to send them back to those places, then you're going to have a refugee crisis. These Muslims will try to go to other places, and that is what creates, undermines international peace and security, something that the UN Security Council is charged with maintaining. And that's where it really becomes an international crisis and not simply an Indian issue. And so the ramifications of this are significant with regards to the Bangladeshi origin Muslims in India, Rohingyas who are there, and a number of other entities as well. Next, please. You can fill up the slide, please. So I just want to very briefly mention that the Hindutva ideology of the BJP government and the brazen policies that they have put in place have really brought a bad name to India and its claim of being the world's biggest democracy. Democracy simply doesn't work in a vacuum. It isn't something that functions in without a number of other issues that are attached to this. Upholding human rights is a fundamental element of a progressive democratic state, and where India fails, and what especially the BJP government fails, is particularly this goal. And the increasing criticism of its flagrant violations, especially with regards to Kashmir, the CAA, state violence across the country, is really being noticed now at the international level. But perhaps what is most concerning, and it's not concerning necessarily for the international community as much as it should be for Indians themselves, is the erosion of key institutions in India which are charged with keeping the state in check. Now I'm talking about the Supreme Court of India, I'm talking about various other entities. Now we have a concept known as system criminality. This is where the entire state apparatus is used to commit international crimes or to commit crimes within a state. The most obvious example of this is Nazi Germany, where you had the entire state, from the postal service to the politicians to everyone, passing laws and implementing those laws, and the police service and the Gestapo and everyone that you can imagine being involved in perpetrating some of the most heinous crimes in history. And where do we see a repetition of this? Right now in BJP governed India, where you have the police. If you look at the Delhi protests that were taking place and how they're specifically targeting the protesters and not the Hindu mobs that were targeting them. If we look at the judiciary in India, who have taken absurd decisions. As a lawyer, and I'm sure anyone who has any understanding of justice, fairness, the law, legislation, can agree to this, is that the decision on, say, the Babri Masjid, the initial decision, as well as the current, the most recent one, in which they said that simply no planned strategy was involved when bringing down the Babri Masjid, demolishing the Babri Masjid. This is simply, a joke. Anyone who can understand the basics of constitutional law would know that this is something, deliberately turning a blind eye to this. And in part, the judiciary is coming up with these decisions, not only because it has become partisan, but also because the prosecution, the state lawyer who is supposed to fight this case, is not providing the evidence or is seriously undermining the case themselves. So if we look at the Samjhota Express judgment that came about, or if we look at a number of other cases against Muslims especially, we see, against Hindu mobs and the leaders of these mobs, when they're brought to trial, the prosecution case is extremely weak. And who builds the prosecution case? It is the police that does the investigation. So they themselves are implicated in allowing these people to get off scot-free from things that often, you have videos of them admitting to. So this is really what the biggest concern is that you now have a system criminality that is developing in India, where you have the entire state apparatus operating, and perhaps the biggest example of this is what's happening in Kashmir, where you have the entire armed forces involved, where you have various security entities involved, committing the worst forms of atrocities that you will find anywhere in the world that Muzzammil Saab has already alluded to. And that's really what the concern is now. So, and secondly, my last point is, we can see the law is something that we can see and touch. But when you have system criminality in a system, the CAA also requires that there are tribunals that determine whether you are a citizen or not. What about the mindset of the judge sitting in that tribunal? What about the individual who has to issue you a citizenship document? If this individual is bigoted, is part of the system criminality that is taking place, then the informal mechanisms or the mechanisms and the issues that you cannot see are going to be equally, if not more damaging than simply the Citizenship Amendment Act. And we see how the BJP government is forcing these things. For example, in Kashmir, a domicile certificate has to be issued in 15 days. Otherwise, the individual who is issuing this domicile certificate is to be punished. There's, disciplinary proceedings that can go against him. So they're forcing their agenda through a variety of means across India, and specifically targeting Muslims. This is something that's very dangerous for Muslims within India, but certainly for the region itself. I'm just going to end at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. We're unable to connect to Dr. Salma. She's having technical difficulties. And while we do sort that out, I'd like to ask Mr. Oves a question. So you've mentioned an institutional overdrive, an institutional suppressing of rights in India, with the key institutions not working. And even though, regardless of the fact the national voices have been rising against the move, what avenues, and this is a question that's been asked of international experts a lot, what avenues does Pakistan or even regional countries, those being affected, have against the CAA?
That's certainly a very important question. The problem is that domestically within India, as I mentioned, when you have something, when you have state institutions which are complicit in this, this reminds me of a famous quote by Robert Jackson, who's a US Supreme Court judge. And he said that we are not final because we are infallible, but we are infallible only because we are final. So when the Supreme Court takes a bad decision, there is no appeal after that. They have taken their decision, and that is what the decision is. A lot of people are pinning their hopes on, say, the revocation of Article 370 or the evisceration of Article 370, that the Supreme Court will do something. Don't have a lot of hopes on that. The Supreme Court has shown its face. It has shown what could be expected from them. So there isn't a lot of hope on what the Supreme Court will do. So within India, I do not think that there's a lot that can be done. It's going into a very dangerous direction because the BJP government has certainly been able to convince its population that what it's doing is right. What we've noted is that in the previous election, people did not vote on actual issues like the economy or jobs or these things. They voted on religious lines. And that is something that, again, is extremely dangerous and really speaks to, again, the two-nation theory and why Pakistan was created. That's one thing. At the international stage, however, I think there's a lot that can be done, not only from Pakistan's point of view, but the international community has to be brought into this. We need to abide by, the recommendations that have been given by the US, freedom of religion entity that looks at that, of imposing sanctions. The European Union certainly has a regime of this. We know that the UK government has a regime under its Magnitsky laws, looking at where human rights defenders are suppressed, and we see a lot of that happening in India. Then, of course, there are UN mechanisms. So there are complaints that can be brought through the CERD mechanism, the Convention Against Racial Discrimination. There is working with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and perhaps even the High Commissioner for Refugees, and looking at how we can build the international pressure. Again, going to an international court, India, because it knows it's violating international law, has closed all avenues to international adjudication on whether it's Kashmir or anything like that. It's got very strong reservations against its declaration accepting the ICJ's jurisdiction. So it's not really a court of justice that we need to go to. It's a court of public opinion that we really need to appeal to. That governments across the world understand that when they're supporting India, or when they're investing in India, or when they're supporting Indian trade links, they are doing that to a country that is violating human rights on a mass basis that has rarely been seen in the past 70 years. And so that is something I think that the real focus needs to be on. Whether Pakistan does that and how it does that really depends on a number of factors in our diplomacy. But it's really, I think, everyone's problem. Human rights anywhere is, a violation of human rights anywhere is a violation of human rights everywhere. So I think that's something that needs to be seen. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. It is a pleasure to announce that Dr. Ramesh Kumar has indeed joined us now. I hope, Dr. Ramesh, that you can hear me. Dr. Ramesh, am I getting across to you fine, sir? Unfortunately, we still haven't been able to sort out technical issues there. We'll move towards another question which has been sent in by Ambassador Asif Durrani, and that is to Mr. Anwar as well. So you've talked about the system criminality now being witnessed in India with regard to human rights violations. Can we approach the US and the Western justice system to seek legal remedy?
Again, as I just discussed, most countries have, I mean, most Western countries certainly have a mechanism for dealing with countries that are serial violators of international human rights law or international humanitarian law, which is the law of war. And so countries that are involved in crimes against humanity, war crimes, and serious human rights abuses, that is something that these countries have laws to do it. The problem is that triggering these laws is really a domestic political decision. And that is where building the pressure is really key. So what we see and these are known as global Magnitsky laws, forgive me, which look at countries which violate this and then automatically impose sanctions. But the problem is, whether it's the UK or whether it's the United States or whether it's European countries, they've always had a soft spot, and there are a number of geopolitical reasons for this, geostrategic reasons for this. India is the darling of the West at the moment because it is seen as a counter-check to China's ascendancy. It is something that is going to allow for a lot of India's violations to take place, and this is exactly why Modi thinks that he can do what he's doing, because he knows he's going to get away with a lot of this. But if the international human rights order is to remain, countries are going to have to take a stand. Now, one of the biggest problems we've seen with the Trump administration has been the erosion of international checks on countries around the world for their human rights violations, because it has never been a priority for the Trump administration to really check countries on that. Now, hopefully, I mean, if you have a change in regime, we do see that Kamala Harris, for example, the vice presidential candidate, has been critical of moves by India. Biden has been a proponent of human rights, not as strong as many would want, but the Democrats have generally been stronger on that front. So that's certainly something that we can look forward to. The Labour Party in the UK, for example, is an entity that has stood by the Kashmiris, that has stood by those oppressed by the Indian government again and again, which is something that is quite encouraging. And you have entities across the world there. The European Union has a policy in place for countries that illegally annex territory. And so we see that, especially in the Kashmir context, an illegal annexation has taken place. The failure on, say, Pakistan's part is building that legal narrative that legally an annexation has taken place. And our organization, the Research Society of International Law, has tried to work on developing the language that we use as a state in our foreign policy needs to be the language of international humanitarian law, which then defines that an occupation took place and then an annexation took place. So I think it's really about focusing on these countries, building the international pressure. And this is not just by the government of Pakistan, but by the people, and especially the Kashmiri diaspora and Indian Muslims across the world, which are a very strong tool, I think, to be able to push the Indian government to do the right thing. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And I think this time around, we actually do have Dr. Ramesh on board with us. Welcome, Dr. Ramesh. It's a pleasure to have you with us. I yield the floor now to you without further ado for your address. Dr. Ramesh, can you please unmute your mic?
Hello.
We can hear you, sir.
Hello.
Perfect.
Yes. Thank you very much. And I'm thankful. It's a great pleasure for me that you have called me on this important topic. And I think so many guests are here and have spoken very well. I have listened one speech now. Actually, the Citizen Act bill is against the Constitution of India. If you see, the India was the secular country, but now the moment after the passing of the Citizen Act bill, all the Indian community is against the Modi government, which was the popular government before, but now they are facing too much difficulties even there also. So I think in the Kashmir, there is too much discrimination. Article 35, 370 It is injustice with the Kashmiri people. But now the Citizen Act is more than the Kashmir issue in the India, because the minority communities have the huge population of more than I think 300 million people are Muslim community, and they feel discrimination if the Citizen Act bill says that Muslim community will not get the benefit from this bill. So it is I think it is not a Mahatma Gandhi India or Nehru India. It is but I have seen now the Hindutva. I want to clear the Hindutva is not a religion. Hindutva is a ideology of the Narendra Modi or any Hitler inspired leadership, because Hinduism is the religion, Sanatan Dharma is the religion which teach us the peace, interfaith and harmony. So it is clear every religion respect the human being. But there, this type of discrimination, I think it is a very unfortunate condition in India, because if you go behind 7-8 years, in India, so many people are living, but very democratically the India is running, but now they are in the extremist VN. So again, I also want to speak in Urdu for other gentlemen, because 50% are from the Urdu community. तो मेरा कहने का मकसद ये है कि ये जो इंडिया के अंदर इस वक्त जो नरेंद्र मोदी की जो गवर्नमेंट है, जो जिस किस्म का उसने माहौल पैदा किया है, मैं समझता हूँ इंडिया की अपनी आइडियोलॉजी जो थी एक सेकुलरिज्म की और महात्मा गांधी की, जो मुसलमान के तहफ़्फ़ुज़ के लिए इंडिया में दिल्ली की 1947 के बाद जब ये हंगामे हुए तो खुद दिल्ली की बाजारों में बीच में खुद खड़े हो गया था उनकी प्रोटेक्शन के हवाले से, और वो पाकिस्तान के अंदर हिंदू कम्युनिटी के लिए खुद खड़ा हो गया था। तो एक तो ये जो पॉलिसी है स्पेशली सिटीजन एक्ट वाली, मैं समझता हूँ ये इंडिया की आइडियोलॉजी को चेंज कर रही है और ये हेट आइडियोलॉजी के ऊपर जा रही है, और जो इंडिया एक सेक्युलर कंट्री था उसके ऊपर बहुत बड़ा क्वेश्चन मार्क है। एक तो ये चीज है। दूसरी ये कि अभी आपने देखा कि 11 लोगों का जो मर्डर हुआ, 11 लोगों का मर्डर हुआ, पाकिस्तान डैशिंग जो है आज तक इंडिया में खत्म नहीं हुआ है, स्पेशली बीजेपी गवर्नमेंट की तरफ से। It is unfortunately, it is a bad luck for the Indian people and Pakistani people both, because both the community wants to a close relationship between the both countries. Too much relations क्योंकि बहुत ज्यादा रिलेशन है आपस में, तो इस वजह से लोगों को जिस किस्म की पाकिस्तान डैशिंग, मैंने ये चौथी इलेक्शन लड़ी है पाकिस्तान में। पाकिस्तान की जो भी इलेक्शन हुई, चाहे मुशर्रफ का टाइम था, चाहे जरदारी का था, चाहे मियां साहब का था, चाहे खान साहब का था, हर वक्त एक ही आवाज आती थी कि हम चाहते हैं कि पड़ोसी मुल्कों के साथ, इंडिया के साथ हमारे तल्लुकात बेहतर हो। मगर वहां पे हमेशा ये बात की जाती है कि हमारे जो है वो रिलेशन खराब, अपना पाकिस्तान को हम सबक सिखाएंगे। मैं समझता हूँ इनको इनसे सीखना पड़ेगा, ऐसी चीजें नहीं करनी चाहिए। मैं सख्त लफ्जों में मजम्मत करता हूँ। अपना सिटीजन एक्ट जो बिल पास हुआ है, मैं समझता हूँ इंडिया के जो मुहब्ब वतन है वो उस बिल को वापस कराएं, आर्टिकल 35, 370 उसको वापस कराएं, और 11 लोगों का जो मर्डर हुआ है उन लोगों के हवाले से भी वो अपना जो पाकिस्तान को जो इंटरनेशनल ट्रीटी है उस हवाले से एक्सेस दें और उनको स्पेस दें कि कम से कम उनके साथ भी इंसाफ होना चाहिए, और अब ये डैशिंग का मरला जो है वो खत्म होना चाहिए। आई एम अगेन थैंकफुल फॉर टेकिंग मी ऑन दिस इम्पोर्टेंट टॉपिक। थैंक यू वेरी मच।
Thank you, sir, for your words. We're still having technical difficulties in connecting to Dr. Salma, and we've had to improvise a little. We've taken her on our mobile phone call, and she'll speak to us via that speakerphone. Dr. Salma, if you can hear us. Dr. Salma, if you can hear us, please.
Okay, I can hear you.
Ma'am, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. My deepest apologies for creating such a technical glitch. and I'm extremely grateful to IPRI, to the IPRI's young dynamic team for the troubleshooters, and above all, President IPRI, Brigadier Rashid Bari-Chanchua. The topic that I have to cover, the impact of CAA in South Asia, exacerbating existing regional fault lines. The scheme of presentation that I had planned to share with you all would somewhat go like this, that we are going to look at the citizenship right. Is it a right or a privilege, or is it a nation-building exercise? Then India's long-standing slogan of secularism. So should we take it as a political mantra or a genuine framework? Ideology as a tool of nation-building and legitimacy, and last and the most important, repercussions within India and in the region as well. So when we are looking at citizenship, whether it is a right or a privilege, or is it a nation-building exercise, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights proclaims that everyone has a right to a nationality. And this does not have any shades of discrimination based on color, caste, creed, location, religion, etc. And furthermore, it goes on to say that no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his nationality. If we move further, however, when we see in the post-colonial South Asia, when it emerged from the opposition to the British divide and rule strategies, the anti-colonial nationalists, especially if we are focusing the Indian nationalists, who were very sharp on the nation-building exercise. So they rose to the helm of the post-colonial entities by seeking to consolidate and unite the polities of the new nation-state through stringent national ideologies and majoritarian policies. And these ideologies more or less reflected the interest of the new political elite, whether it was secularists, they were Buddhists, they were Islamists, etc. And these new political elites, who, as a matter of fact, had litigated and struggled against the colonial legacy, ended up actually embracing the same ideology and the legacy of the colonials by doing administrative centralization and ideological idioms of monolithic and indivisible sovereignty, which actually ended up enfranchising elements of the populace that deviated from the officially sponsored discourse on nationalism. When we are focusing into this, Dr. Aisha Jalal actually has a very interesting take on this, that this narrow concept of membership to include only those who subscribe to particular national ideologies and identities, the central institutions of these post-colonial states pursued citizenship laws and policies which permitted the disenfranchisement of whole sections of the polity, which, as you can see, is reflected in how India is looking at its Citizenship Act nowadays. If the section's singular allegiance to the monolithic concept of nationhood could be called in question. Membership goods were also distributed in accordance with perceived loyalty to the state and the nation. So in the nascent years, even when there was this appeal towards secularism, citizenship was being used very selectively, and it was being articulated very selectively. And the last point about distribution of membership goods was in favor of groups towing the nationalist line, which deepened further the rifts in the society pitting groups against each other in a scramble for the bigger share of scarce resources. And then, as the genuine or construed competition for resources grew, these groups began to pursue more fragmental models of membership, demanding the absolute intergroup allegiance of individuals for a share in the larger resource cake, you can call it, or you can call it a resource basis that there was. So moving further, what we see is that the multi-ethnic, religious, and group identities of the policy technically in the South Asian framework transcended the boundaries of the new nation states. These post-colonial states had many crossovers of nationalities, religious groups moving from one direction to another. And the history of the pre-colonial, colonial, post-colonial group migration produced polities with historical transnational regional ties, which further enabled the political elites to delegitimize the disenfranchisement of groups whom they willfully could put portray as having chosen ties to other states and demanding their repatriation. But unfortunately, when we're looking at repatriation, that too became problematic as receiving states, such as Pakistan's case, the Bihari nationals who are stranded in Bangladesh, the Assami nationals, the Bengali nationals who had crossed over into Assam, and many of the population groups, the Gurkhas, many others, they could not be repatriated because it became highly problematic for the receiving states who were often experiencing similar intergroup tensions and competition. So when we're looking at secularism in the framework of the Indian polity, we see that there has been idealist Nehru-Gandhian secularism, which has been the shining model of political appeal for the Indians worldwide. And the point of departure when the British were leaving India, this Nehru-Gandhian secularism was used to its maximum currency to pinpoint the fact that Jinnah's Pakistan was a wrong creation, and Indian secularism was the entire expression of all that stood well in that crown, the British jewel in the British crown, and that it should not be broken. And Mountbatten and many others had this notion that Jinnah and others were trying to fracture that jewel in the crown that they were trying to leave intact. However, when we look closer into this prism of secularism, we find that although there had been attempts by people such as B.R. Ambedkar and others who tried to have a constitution which was as representative and as secular and fulfill the rights of the citizens of India, but gradually all of these clauses and articles were changed and transformed to suit the larger body politics of India and the political elite that I was just mentioning previously. So what we can see is that not only the Indian Constitution and now very vocally the Indian Supreme Court has been doing away with everything that has been said in the Constitution, and they are wedded more to the how the state practice is coming forth in India and what the rights of citizens, which are claimed regardless of their caste, religion, color, point of origin, are all being put to question. So, and furthermore, we would like to see how this secularism transformed to Hindu nationalism, and finally, did secularism really deliver? So, what we see is that even prior to the creation of the state of India, the secularism was used as a very potent political currency, but the secularists themselves fully embraced Hindu nationalists such as Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, who authored the Vande Mataram, the national anthem that the Indian National Congress later adopted. And one of Chatterjee's epic novels, Anandamat, which he wrote in 1882, talks about the hero Satyananda, who has killed in a fictional battle all the Muslim officers and Muslim soldiers, having all fled, which kind of shows a very derogatory way that they were not brave enough to stand the ground, and the British remained. And Satyananda talks to his master, which is technically Chatterjee himself, who tells him that he orders Satyananda to cease killing. To which Satyananda, in entire puzzlement, asks, why do you think that I should not kill? Because so he, the boss, replies, your task is accomplished, the Muslim power is destroyed. So this anti-Muslim sentiment was always very high in this particular notion. And then when we move further, we see that even in the secularist India, there were many things that were taking place, which actually built the ground for what Modi's India is putting into implementation through its manifesto and many other things. The draft Indian Constitution of 1948 in its Article 9, and then Indian Constitution of 1950 in its Article 15 talks about the fundamental rights of the citizens, that they should not be discriminated against on any grounds, whether it is religion, race, caste, gender, place of birth, or any of them. and no citizen shall be subject to any disability, liability restriction or conditionalities. And then there are many conditionalities which are mentioned. So what we see is that gradually, despite this cloak of secularism being there, from time to time, India tried to bring forth various shades of uniformity. First and foremost, we are talking about the Citizen Amendment Act, but the Citizen Amendment Act cannot be discussed unless you also see the ambience that surrounded it, the National Register of Citizens, the Uniform Civil Code, the Central Anti-Conversion Act. All of them actually strengthen the Citizen Amendment Act, and that has made this particular act very powerful. And coupled with that is the Ayodhya verdict, that is the final nail in the coffin, and the Indian illegal occupation of Jammu and Kashmir, and the changing of the status of Jammu and Kashmir, and annexing it fully into its, and declaring it a union territory. And by doing that, by taking away Article 35A and 370, India has actually ended up removing the special status of the Kashmiri citizens, which was provided in the constitution, through which they had constitutional protection. So the Uniform Civilian Code that we talked about has the Portuguese Civil Code of 1867 as a precedent. However, the Portuguese Civil Code that was imposed in the state of territory of Goa has certain conditionalities and provisions to it, but the Indian Supreme Court and the Indian political agents, they really thought that it's a wonderful opportunity that there has to be a uniform civil code which will bring all the Indians under one ambit. And the Article 44 of the Constitution furthermore goes on to state that the state shall endeavor to secure for all its citizens a uniform civil code throughout the territory of India, which is going to help the cause of national integration. And this, of course, is contrary to the Article 15, which grants right of freedom of religion in Article 25 as well. Then when we move further, we see that the National Register of Citizens, which was amendment to the Citizenship Act of 1955, actually wants to have a national register for nationwide register for the citizens, but it was targeting primarily the Assami Muslim population. And interestingly, Amit Shah and the Modi cronies, they went around talking about the fact that this is the final solution to the Muslim problem. And this is actually reminiscent of the type of narrative that the Nazis and the Hitlers of the world used when they were entering into the genocide and indiscriminate killing of the Jewish citizens during their time of regime. So this transformation from secularism to Hindu nationalism, when we further see the Citizen Amendment Bill or the act was initially initiated in 1955, and it was primarily for foreigners to acquire the Indian citizenship with 7 years of residency as a permanent condition for residents of undivided India, and 12 years for naturalization of others who did not come from the undivided India pre-colonial or colonial. And it has undergone several amendments between the year 1985, 92, 2003, 05, and as well as 15. But what has happened now has become a lot more glaring. It has become much more institutional. And not only has it become institutional, what we technically see is that not only the Supreme Court, but the state practices have taken precedence over the constitution of the state. And the manifesto that the BJP has brought forward in this particular election, as well as the previous elections, is taken as the main document which needs to be emulated and which needs to be implemented. So which technically means that the constitution, the secular foundation, if we call a secular foundation, because as I tried to put the case forward, the secularists also use secularism as a political power rather than implementing it in letter and spirit, and they did what they had to do during their regime. And the Babri Masjid issue, which started in 1955 and went on till such time that in 1985, again a Congress government led by the secularists was the first that the Babri Masjid was closed, it was clamped down, and the desecration started. And also under the secularists, we see not only the Muslims, but the Sikhs being persecuted. The shrine of Harminder Sahib, Amritsar, was badly desecrated. The Sikhs' rights were totally usurped. And what happened as a result of that, one can see, we very well know about it. So, and then we also have this stunning Babri Masjid verdict, where the Supreme Court ended up saying that the Babri Masjid was not built in accordance with the tenets of Islam, which has actually provided a precedent to the Hindu nationalists that they can use this verdict, which is 1,000+ pages long, and use this particular verdict as a precedent to bring down other masajids and places of worship for the Muslims or other minority religions which are targeted by the Indians, and they've already started doing that. They're even talking about Hazrat Bal, they're talking about the shrine of the various Kashmiri leaders, and they're saying that these masajids and all have a million in their foundation, so that means that they were built on top of some previous mandirs and Hindu worship sites, so they need to be raised to the ground. And if the Babri Masjid can be done away with, any of these other masajids can very well be done away with this thing. Then, of course, there's the illegal occupation of the state of Jammu and Kashmir, the Article 370 and 35A that we talked about, which has, by usurping these two articles, the fundamental rights of inheritance property of the Kashmiris has been done away with. Okay, so has the secularism delivered? Unfortunately not. India's liberal nostalgia for a tolerant Hinduism is grossly misplaced. There is this imagined construct and perception of a pristine, tolerant Hinduism, which exists somewhere in that ideals, but it has not really been practiced. And secularism in its entirety died on August 5th, 2019, when Jammu and Kashmir, the only Muslim majority area under Indian occupation, was also dismantled. Furthermore, the secularists actually have ended up creating a cultural vacuum by conceding the path and mimicking populist sentiments propagated by the hardliners. And the liberal elite in India never really divorced itself from its deep entanglement with the caste system as well as patriarchy. And as I said, all of these points, such as the Babri Masjid, the UCC, the NRC, Citizenship Amendment Act, Jammu and Kashmir, desecration of minority religious institutions, are a point in case. Okay, so if you're looking at how the region has reacted, or how the region would react to this, another layer which is not technically part of the Citizenship Act issue, but that is also India trying to assert itself, the expansionist Hindutva India trying to assert itself by remapping itself. And when India introduced the new map to the world, what we saw was that any of its regional friends and allies also started to talk about the discomfort that they felt with an Indian expansionist agenda. And Nepal, the landlocked country, which is highly reliant and dependent on India and totally colonized in another category by India, was the first to pinpoint, and they had a major misgiving with India over the Kalamani area and the map controversy that came up as a result of it. And Nepal was extremely vocal in talking about why India had done what it had done. The second aspect that we look at, the NRC, the National Registration of Citizens thing, as we have seen that many Pakistani citizens crossed over into India, the Hindu-Pakistani nationals, thinking that now there is some promise of a promised Indian Hindu land, and it's going to be, the minute they go over into India, it's going to be something very big and great for them. Unfortunately, that thing never realized. Around 70 to 100,000 Gorkhas of Nepali origin have also been excluded from the NRC. again, the National Registration Register for Citizens and the CAA becomes discriminatory even to its Hindu nationals, despite using the claims that, we are very Hindu-friendly and we are the only Hindu state, the savior of Hindu interest states that we are. One of the Indian scholars at the Oves University, Ayyub, states that India has not many friends left in its neighborhood. Particularly, its relationship with Nepal has deteriorated considerably since its unofficial blockade in 2015, while China is doing everything to get Nepal to its side, although it's in another context. But the very fact that Nepal, despite its smaller size, despite being landlocked, has actually been brave enough to stand up to India and voice its concerns, not only about the map, but also about the Citizenship Amendment Act, also about the national registration of citizens. Second country which has a major problem when it comes to the CAA is Bangladesh, in which the Assami nationals, the Bengali nationals who had migrated to Assam over the decades and over the centuries are now being targeted, detected, and deported back to Bangladesh. And that was something which initially Bangladesh did not really want to comment on, and they said this is India's internal act. But then Amit Shah became very vocal about saying that Bangladesh, along with Pakistan and Afghanistan, are places where the non-Muslim minorities are facing persecution. And these hard-hitting statements by the BJP leadership or the Hindutva leadership is something which is antagonizing India's neighbors and even close allies and friends. And as a result of that, what we see is that the Modi regime is pushing population growth, especially the Assami Muslims, across its eastern borders, singling out and confining huge Muslim population groups into camps, which is an action which is reminiscent of the Nazi camps under the genocidal regime of Adolf Hitler, who was the main, and which actually an action which was the precursor of the Holocaust. So what is India trying to gauge out of this particular notion? India's very strong ally against Pakistan that it has widely used, that is Bangladesh, today stands extremely unhappy and is antagonized by the actions that India is undertaking. Coming to Pakistan and Afghanistan, there are a sizable Hindu as well as Sikh population in Pakistan, and then there is a small yet a very vocal Sikh population in India, in Afghanistan as well. And when these people went over to India thinking that India is offering them a lot of promise, unfortunately that promise was not realized. And the killing of 11 people, which has been reported, is other than many of the bad actions that are taking place against these poor people who have migrated to a promised land, which turned out to be a complete mirage. And they are stranded there, they are stateless, they are no longer citizens of any place, but Pakistan is more than willing to bring them back. The anti-Muslim acts that India is also indulging into has a major resonance in any of the Muslim capitals in the region and around it. And it is also kind of stirring populist sentiment, which is going to unfortunately be harmful for any of the minority religions which are residing in Muslim countries. So what I'm trying to say here is that unfortunately, if there is anything that goes wrong with the Muslim population groups in India, and that have gone wrong, the Muslim population groups or extremist elements or emotional elements in Muslim countries surrounding India react in a knee-jerk fashion. And that is something which is going to be a major destabilizing effect for the region. In a larger connotation, I would also say that in the future, God forbid, if the Muslim persecution which is actually becoming a state practice, if it takes a worse turn, we would then have a huge population outflux into India's flanks, which is Bangladesh, Pakistan, even Sri Lanka, and Maldives. And these are countries which are highly populated and have very little economic and space capacity to reside such a huge population group in its space. But of course, we will have to do that. It is going to create a lot of regional, micro to macro destabilizing effects. Then slogans such as those used in the recent protest, also the Delhi riots, such as Jai Shri Ram, use that, the Gao vigilantism. Let Trump go and then we are going to handle the Muslims, shoot the bloody traitors. And very fascinatingly, this particular slogan saying, Bade dino baad Hindu jaga hai. So these are, and Hindu ka Hindustan. So this type of gives you this idea that India, unfortunately, is moving in a direction which is, if it continues in the same stride, is going to be unrecoverable. And this is going to, and now I'm coming towards the end of my presentation, this is going to give rise to a wave of extremism that would be very difficult to squash for any of the national capitals within the region and even outside it. It is going to have very far-reaching consequences and impact. Also for India as a state polity. It is also going to provide a lot of fodder for exploitative extra-regional forces such as the ISIS or any other religious or pseudo-religious forces which are using religion as an exploitative power to stir public sentiment. Then there has been a reaction from the Islamic world as well, where the UAE, the Saudi Arabian regime tried to tell India to be let go of its hard-hitting policies. And interestingly, even from the West, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom was deeply troubled by the message of the CAA because it considered that it has given the religion criteria in the bill, and it is going to create a religious test for Indian citizenship that would strip citizenship from millions of Muslims. And that would also lead to a wave of migration that would affect the Western capitals as well. Concludingly, I would actually say that what we technically need to see is that in India, in the coming years, under Modi and under Amit Shah, whether it is Amit Shah or Modi, whosoever is going to be ruling India, this part of Hindutva or Hindu nationalism is going to become so deeply entrenched and institutionalized that it is going to disregard the very foundation on which the state of India was made. And India, given its central position, if it unfortunately implodes, or even if it does not implode, it continues with its policies of exclusionism and using this population sentiment and trying to tell the Hindu nationals that the Muslims were the usurpers and the Muslims need to be out of the system. It is going to create such a strong ripple effect that the entire region will not be able to cushion it fully. Not only this, furthermore, what it is going to do is that it is going to totally destroy the body politics of the state of India. And that is going to be something irrecoverable. Why the world is not very strongly moved by this? Because for the moment, the Christian population and other population groups are not being targeted. But that is not far that the Christian population groups who have been in the previous tenures under Vajpayee and others during the 80s and the 90s have been targeted. Christian nuns have been targeted, Christian missionaries have been targeted, they have been lynched, they have been burnt by Hindu jathas. If this continues, then the repercussions are going to also be felt in the Western capitals. And this particular notion that this point which was raised by the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom is something that the Americans need to really focus on instead of looking at the shiny India model and the enlightened India. But unfortunately, what we see is that the entire world is more focused on economic development, and religious persecution is not exactly a very high agenda when it comes to today's contemporary real politics, so to speak. I would end here. My apologies that I could not join you people in person or online. But my deepest gratitude to the team of IPRI for allowing me to be represented in whatever capacity. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. No worries for the technical error. In fact, the experiment was successful. Can you hear me? Am I audible?
I can very well hear you. Thank you.
All right, thank you, ma'am. I'd like to bring in Mr. Muzzammil into the conversation as we formally commence with the question and answer session. Mr. Umar Farooq, an assistant research officer from IPRI, would like to know about what the Pakistani diaspora living in the UK can do to highlight the atrocities of the Indian government and what challenges do they face in light of the influence of the Indian lobby. Mr. Muzzammil.
I'll begin by giving an example. And it's a rhetorical question, but post Yasser Arafat, can anybody tell me who represents the Palestinian movement internationally? Probably not. What about the Libyans? What about the Uyghurs? What about the Yemeni? So this is the problem. And although that we have, as a Kashmiri and all Kashmiris, we have the utmost love and respect and regard for Pakistan, but ultimately the problem is that India banks on Pakistan being the primary source of the primary advocate for Kashmir, because then they're able to change the narrative. They're able to label Pakistan as occupies. They call Azad Kashmir as Pakistan occupied Kashmir, and you give them that opportunity. The best way for the Pakistani diaspora to support the Kashmir cause is by empowering the Indian occupied Kashmiris themselves to lobby the case of Kashmir, to lobby the cause of Kashmir in power corridors. We are doing that, but at the same time, there is a population of at least 1.5 million people that identify themselves from Azad Kashmir or from Pakistan living in the United Kingdom, and that is a huge population. I mean, there are constituencies that depend on the diaspora vote bank when they come into power, particularly for the Labour Party. And that said, again, I would strongly recommend that you empower those Kashmiris. You find those Kashmiris that are working towards a settlement for the Kashmiri issue, and you give them the resources, the manpower, the literature, the a helping hand to get that across to the people in power corridors. But also, it is about tangibly doing what you can do within your, I don't want to say within your power, but within your resources. So you have universities. There are so many different universities in the United Kingdom where you have Pakistani societies, where you have, and I'm sure Oves is well aware of this as well, that you have Pakistani societies. And more often than not, and here's the problem, what I have a problem with, particularly with the diaspora, is that we always seem to ask the Pakistani community or the Pakistani societies in universities to lobby the case of Kashmir. Why not the Amnesty Society? Why not the Law Society? Why not the Human Rights Society? Why not the, there are so many different groups that we can work with, we can coordinate with. If you look at the Palestinian movement, the BDS movement is not a standalone movement. The BDS partners with other institutions and organizations. If we are an occupied nation, we should also be talking to the people like, I don't know, the Bosnians that went through similar to what the people of Kashmir went through. So it's linking our narrative with other people's narrative. And I think in Urdu, I can't immediately think of the word in English, but jagana, to awaken the consciousness of people and remind them of what has happened. And not that I have a huge affinity to the people of to the Israelis, but there is a particular group that went through the Holocaust and they know what a Holocaust is. And even if we can use the support of certain groups and parties that have an understanding of what it means to be occupied, subjugated, and oppressed, then why not use that? So I think we need to expand our horizons and think out of the box. I mean, we're living in 2020, we're coming up to 2021, and we're still using, most of us are still using policies and strategies from 1947 to 1990. I mean, times have changed, continents have drifted, geopolitical and strategic interests have completely evolved. And I think we need to think on those lines and think outside of the box and stop repeating the old-fashioned arguments and old-fashioned strategies. And I'll probably end with this, that it was Einstein that said the definition of madness is doing the same thing again and again and expecting a different result. So let's try something different. Let's try different ways and means to achieve our goals. I mean, now you have the internet, you have social media. We know what Twitter storms are, but let me also tell you that the era of Twitter storms is finished, and yet we're still doing it. There are so many other things that can be done to politicize, to publicize, and then to impact different causes.
Thank you, sir. And an extension to the same question that I asked you, Mr. Khalid Chande, who's a research fellow here at IPRI, would want to know how the UK government, given its historical affinity with the subcontinent, how it can remedy its mistakes, as he poses it, and help resolve the Kashmir dispute.
There are many ways you can remedy the mistake. The problem is, are they prepared to do so? And that is the primary question. And at this point in time, where you have a conservative government, slightly right wing. I mean, I say that very loosely when I say slightly, but they're pretty right wing. And their interests, particularly after Brexit, is always going to be trade negotiations where they have to restructure and think about what's in their best interest. And I think Oves mentioned this very bluntly, that everybody has self-interest. Geopolitical, strategic interests seem to be the order of the day, and human rights is not such a huge importance. But at the same time, we've also seen how Western governments, including the United Kingdom, are very critical of China, despite importing heavily from that country. So in the same way, I don't think that there is a reason why particularly the United Kingdom can't condemn the atrocities in Kashmir. But here's the problem. Condemnation is not enough. Statements are not enough. And there's a new phenomena that's happened in the UK over the last few years, particularly with the BJP winning the second election. And that is the Indian community have become organized. The Hindu community have become organized. And they've learnt it from us. When I mean us, I mean the Muslims, the Pakistanis, the Azad Kashmiris, and the Kashmiris. They've learned what we've done, and they've manipulated it to the extent where now they are the ones that preemptively write letters and lobby parliamentarians and the government. And we're left reacting to it instead of being proactive. And that's a problem. And you can blame individuals and groups and organizations for not being proactive, but here's the problem. If you don't have the resources and the manpower to be, or people behind your back to support it, then we can't be as effective. In the United Kingdom, you have BJP sympathizers. I think there were more than 80 organizations that recently sent a letter to the Conservative Party telling them or describing their frustrations and disappointment at the government's not the government, but the what we call all parties parliamentary group. So it's a cross-party group, or the Conservative Friends of Kashmir. The term was the Conservative Friends of Kashmir group. And the British Indians lobbied the parliamentarians, lobbied the government to say that this is discriminatory. There is Hindu phobia. I mean, this is a new, it's not a phenomena. It's fake language, and they're using this for their own ends. And that's the problem, that we need to think outside of the box. Whatever the British government can do, won't do. So, as again, I'm going to refer back to always what he said, is the court of public opinion that matters more than what the politicians will do. And the way the politicians, sadly, this is how it works in most democratic nations, particularly in the West, that politicians will only adopt policy or entertain people's reservations when the constituency members lobby them. If there are only 3 people that lobby a particular member of parliament, he does not take it seriously. And I don't care if you're part of that constituency or not, but when you have 100,000 letters being sent to 500 MPs, it means something.
Thank you, sir. And another improvisation on the same question, you've mentioned the Court of Public Opinion, Mr. Hamza Rifat, who's an ARO at IPRI, asks that the BJP ideology is being allowed to fester under the Modi-led government, and it enjoys widespread support in the community. How can this fascism be reversed in Kashmir and across India specifically?
If it's been done once, twice before, then that is the only way that I can see as a viable option. And I'm referring specifically to Mussolini, to Hitler, and to Stalin. And I think that in itself should be an explanation. I'm not advocating for war. I'm not advocating for World War III, but for all practical purposes, when the West thought they defeated fascism through war, they thought that that was the end of it. And now we're going to go through capitalism. We're going to go through democratic ways. But with the rise of fascism, there is only one solution. And that's, I don't think I should go beyond those words.
Thank you, sir. And speaking of fascism, Mr. Oves Anwar, Ms. Maheen Ahmed, another era would like to ask that when the Indian law community is faced with criticism and assertions that the CAA is a violation of both domestic and international law, how do they respond? And the legal justifications they give, are they appropriate?
Thank you for the question. So this is a very interesting thing. You have some excellent neutral lawyers, former members of the judiciary, who quite openly come out and say that this is completely discriminatory. You also have members who have come out and said, that the evisceration of Article 370 of the Constitution is completely unconstitutional. And if you look at the mechanisms that the BJP government has used, they are such a blatant violation of the Constitution. If we look at Article 370 and how it was eviscerated, they had to change the meaning or the interpretation clause of the Indian Constitution to allow for a reinterpretation of Article 370 and giving certain powers to the president. And then, so this wasn't even a constitutional amendment. This was literally a game that was played with the Constitution. Now, and I can certainly say without any doubt that had this happened in Pakistan, had, for example, some similar constitutional surgery taken place here, it would have been struck down within the first week. Because I know that our Constitution is protected by a judiciary that, regardless of whatever ills it may be facing, stands up to such issues. But what we see in India is that they've allowed to have whatever challenges are taking place within India to really drag on. And that allows for changes on the ground to take place that at times can become irreversible. So even if a decision later on by the Supreme Court nullifies Article 370, what's happened on the ground in Kashmir will stay. And that will become a permanent feature of the demographic change of all the other changes that are taking place in Kashmir. We do see a lot of criticism of the Citizen Amendment Act within India, especially from proponents of secularism, members of the legal community there. But then at the same time, you see individuals who have come up with a lot of legal jargon, and the problem with lawyers is that you can argue both ways on almost any issue, and that's why they pay us so much money, right? But that's really what the concern is, and because the Citizenship Amendment Act has been passed, it is a law under the statute books. The only foreseeable or thing that you can foresee a challenge to it is by the Supreme Court, which really doesn't seem to be something that is an entity that is taking rational, neutral decisions. We see the Mumbai High Court taking far better decisions than the Indian Supreme Court. And so that's really what the concern is here.
Thank you, sir. The next question is addressed to Dr. Salma Malik. The question is that the Hindu political parties and their struggle towards constitutional empowerment has brought religion as a political and a social force in India. What do you think, and how do you think has this strengthened the country's political culture, and has it made India a Hindu democracy?
Thank you very much. That's a very fascinating question. I would actually say this, that democracy has now become a very relative term. And this passive democracy or democratic cultures which are found everywhere in the world. And one aspect which is very important to understand, that even when we look at the US as a democracy with an ultra-nationalist agenda, we have these majoritarian politics which are really trying to express themselves in a big fashion, and they're trying to assert themselves. Now, what has happened is, and the point that I raised during the presentation as well, was that the liberal or the secularist parties in India, instead of providing a forceful counter-narrative to the fascist dictum of BJP or Shiv Sena or any of the Sangh Parivar ideology, they ended up aligning themselves through very soft paddling as well as through very soft words with what had happened. And the case in point is the Babri Masjid. That when the Babri Masjid took place, none of the secular parties, mainly I would say the Congress, had anything to say about it. In fact, they condoned the action rather than condemning it. And of course, they had no space to condone it because the Babri Masjid problem initially had been put on table in 1955. That was Gandhi's time period. And the first brick that fell off Babri Mosque was in 1985, again a Congress government. And then finally under Rajiv Gandhi and all that stuff that had happened. But the very fact is that none of the political parties which are non-Sangh Parivar or which claim to be liberal or secular have really invested enough to create or expand the secular space. They have not institutionalized the secular space. In fact, what they have done is that they have seen that BJP uses the nationalist, the Hindutva ideology to gain a vote base, and as a result of that, they also kind of say similar stuff. And that has ended up creating far more trouble than the BJP could actually do because they become more legitimized as a result of it. And the democracy is being used simply because that is the best way this majoritarian politics can express itself. So yes, democracy would remain there, but how long that democracy remains truly electoral based and based on people's aspirations, that is to be seen because after BJP's first tenure, it was considered that because BJP's scorecard with regards minority religions was not all that great, that it would not do very well. But what we have seen is that the next time they got voted into power, they came with a bigger majority than they did in the previous stint.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question that we have is open to any speaker who would want to answer, and that is the international and the regional implications of India's acts and India's maneuvers. Can we expect cancellations of deals and agreements between regional bodies in India or multilateral organizations in India, and to what extent would the international community is prepared to preserve minority rights in India?
If I may just say two quick lines, the world is caste-striped and they're looking for markets where they can sell their commodity. So the name of the game is economics. I really doubt that the world is going to be very deeply moved by the atrocities against the minorities. The few of the points that I raised, the American concerns and coming from UAE as well as Saudi Arabia, are at max the only concerns, and of course Iran also said what it had to say. But that hasn't really stopped India from doing things in a big fashion. Although the Delhi riots did simmer down after UAE's very strong reprimand. But would countries actually not sign agreements with India? That is to be seen because in this particular world where economics is taking precedence, and parallel you have ultra-nationalism at its all-time high. These things are selectively overlooked.
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Oves, Anwar, Mr. Muzzammil, would you like to add into the question?
Yes, if I may. So again, I'm going to try to focus on my strengths. So keep this related to international law and the implications that, say, the CAA or other actions that India has taken on the international legal regime. What we need to understand is these types of actions really expose the fragility of the international legal order. At a time when the US, which has at least ostensibly tried to be the guarantor of international human rights, or where the Western world has tried to come off as the bulwark of international human rights, we really see that when they turn a blind eye to these actions, that the entire regime, the facade of international human rights, starts crumbling. And this is certainly what India is doing. It's taking a lot from Israel's playbook, because Israel, again, claiming itself to be the only democracy in the Middle East as such, has been committing atrocities at a level that are unimaginable if you're not really involved there. And what we see India doing, especially with its colonial settler expansionist plans with regards to Jammu and Kashmir, but also elsewhere within India, are exactly taken from the precedent that has been set by Israel. So because Israel was left unchecked, now India says, we have a precedent, we're doing the same thing. Why are you going to criticize us? Now, if India is left unchecked, who knows what the next, where the next domino will fall, and which other, authoritarian fascist regimes around the world, and which, there's no shortage of, what types of actions they will start taking. So the problem with the international human rights legal order is that you have to start taking a stance, a strong stance at every step, at every violation. You have to call it out. Otherwise, it crumbles, because you cannot have this hypocritical, selective criticism. Because once precedents are set, that's how individual countries start quoting those and then getting out of specific situations of criticism and think that they're justified in doing this. So that's really my biggest concern of how this impacts the international legal order, especially the human rights order. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Muzzammil, would you have anything to add?
I echo both speakers and their comments. They're absolutely right. The order of the day is economics. Nobody's going to do anything to India through the strategies that have been currently used through the United Nations. I mean, I can't speak on behalf of the entire legal fraternity, but whatever can be done through the ICC and the ICJ is probably something that is more plausible than the United Nations. The United Nations seems to be a defunct organization. I've been going there for several years now, and it's literally scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. Everybody's in it for favors for one another. And even with the ICC, ICJ, I think you have to be signatories to them before you can apply or appeal through them. So that there have to be other mechanisms that exist. And unfortunately, if we can't use the ones that exist right now, then maybe we need to create new ones. I know recently that different countries have been trying to create new blocks and new partnerships with one another. So maybe that might be something. We saw Malaysia talk about the atrocities that are happening in Kashmir, and then India banned the import of palm oil. And then when Malaysia's economy suffered, and this is just for a few months, maybe even less, but when Malaysia's economy suffered, they offered them $5 off per ton. Obviously, that's a huge saving for India, but $5 off per ton if they continue to purchase the palm oil. So this is the problem. Economics is important, and also, as we said, the international order is also at risk. I mean, once a precedent is set, then other nations feel that they can do the same. But I may want to push back just a little bit and remind again, this may be going far too back in history, but people like Slobodan Milosevic was convicted. Idi Amin is also another example. You also have that other guy, another African warlord. If anybody remembers Coney 2012, that was a massive campaign. So there are ways, but the problem is, again, even though I did push back on you, Oves, but I am still going to repeat what you said. The court of public opinion matters. It isn't enough to go through the legal processes, because again, lawyers are paid to counter argument and to nullify the other person's argument. So eventually there's always going to be a stalemate. So again, I'll repeat what I said. We need to think outside of that box, outside of the norms, outside of the usual, and outside of the existing strategies that exist. That said, this is not exactly the platform to give those ideas and what can be done and what should be done. But considering that you guys, especially IPRI being in Pakistan and a nation that has been probably the only but also the strongest supporter of Kashmir, I am sure that there must be policymakers and thinkers and intellectuals there that have certain ideas, and I hope that at least that can be translated into action, particularly when internationally. It isn't just enough to be done in the United Nations. I think it's very good when you speak to a wide-ranging audience, but sometimes you do need the personal touch, and I think Imran Khan might be one of those people that can offer that personal touch and influence people. But also, another thing that may be slightly off topic, but I also strongly believe that there should be a delegation of duties, and fine, you have people in ambassadorial roles internationally, but imagine the impact when you create ambassadors who are indigenous people that have suffered firsthand the atrocities that have happened inside Kashmir, or for that matter, whatever's happening inside India. And I'll give you a quick example. If you remember that blonde-haired girl with blue eyes, curly blonde hair, the Palestinian girl, her name was, it escapes me right now, but she became very famous overnight because she represented the Palestinian movement. Young girl, if anybody knows Greta Thunberg, the Swedish young girl that talks about global warming, or about that the North Korean girl that went to the United Nations and spoke her heart out about what was happening in North Korea. And, you know, sometimes the global politics or the traditional form of politics isn't the one that is needed to represent a cause or to influence the court of public opinion. Sometimes it's the individuals that may not necessarily be educated or literate in law, in politics, in international relations, in economics. And those are the ones that create the most impact. One more small example. His name was, again, it evades me. Aylan Kurdi. If you remember Aylan Kurdi, he was a young Syrian boy that was washed up on the shores of, I think it was Greece, and he became the symbol of refugees. And that picture in itself spoke volumes. Or of that, I think it was the Syrian boy that was sitting in the back of an ambulance who was covered in dust. He became a symbol of the brutality that is happening in Syria. And it's the same way that sometimes it isn't nation states and lawyers and doctors and economists and politicians that can represent the cause the best. Sometimes it's the simplest of people that can do it.
Excellent recommendations, sir. I'd like to bring in our Director of Research and Acting President for his closing remarks and possibly to expand on Mr. Muzammil's recommendations.
Thanks, Waleed. On behalf of IPRI, I extend felicitations to all the panelists. Genuinely thankful for your time. Each one of you has come up with very solid arguments, and I'm sure we'll benefit from that. Some of the important takeaways, for example, from Mr. Oves from RSIL, judiciary being partisan and state not helping in prosecution. That's a very important takeaway that we need to take cognizance of in the Indian context. And Indian stonewalling of international law obligations compel us to build a strong legal narrative and to appeal to the court of public opinion instead of solely counting on international institutions, which so far have not yielded very positive results for us. But we must all understand that it's a process, and we keep reminding the world conscience of its obligations. I think that's also a job which is to be done sedulously. And if we follow the lawfare options along with public diplomacy, I think we can mobilize the diaspora also and the Kashmiri indigenous population, which is at the receiving end of all the persecution. I think those Kashmiris and the diaspora can be ideally utilized to into our public policy and also to use the lawfare options. We were fortunate to have Mr. Ramesh with us, who's a member of Hindu minority community in Pakistan, and it was indeed enlightening to listen from him once he said that Nehruvian India and Gandhi's concept in India has been taken over by a revanchist Modi's and RSS ideology. An important takeaway was his pointing out that Hindutva is not a religion per se. We must make a distinction between the two because it's a hateful creed. So it's something that is based upon an exclusivist agenda, and it appeals to the basest of the instincts. It's more like atavistic. It's more like atavism, which tries to exclude everybody else. and it's aimed at denial of fundamental rights. So this distinction needs to be made. And the example of 11 Hindus who migrated and remained in India, Jodhpur, and they were being utilized for, doing the acts of espionage by RAW. And when they refused to be part of that, they were in cold blood murdered. So a case has also been launched by one of their relatives in Pakistan, and an FIR has been launched. So this is again a grim reminder and a stark reminder to the world conscience of the kind of hateful creed that is being imposed, and its equally cruel votaries who are in the political mainstream, unfortunately, in India. Mr. Muzzammil, what you said about Israel, what Israel achieved in 50 years, Modi and RSS combined has achieved in India in 1 year. I think that was very relevant, and we must be cognizant of that reality and configure all our options and do all that is possible on advocacy front and on lawfare front, as well as raising the issue on all international and regional fora. Dr. Salma's assertion about NRC targeting and the Assamese Muslims and the state practices that have taken over the Constitution of India was a very important takeaway to my mind. And I think the state and our diplomatic community should take note of that. And again, there are international forums where we can go and agitate this issue, that the state practices, if left alone and not challenged, can become, customary law. We know that India is in the throes of apartheid, and it's a misanthropic and a xenophobic creed that is being imposed upon a country that once prided itself on its inclusivity and its pluralism. So this kind of particularism is a threat, in fact, to the Indian unity itself. And the earliest all the sane communities inside India and in the region take note of that, the better. With this, I once again thank the panelists for a very enlightening discourse. And I'm sure many of the recommendations that they proffered will go a long way in clearing our understanding of the issue, as well as taking some actionable policy prescription on that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. And with this, this brings us to the end of today's webinar. I would like to thank all our speakers for their participation. We lost Dr. Salma and Dr. Ramesh during the question and answer session, but their contribution is valuable to the discourse. I would also like to take this opportunity to invite all participants today to attend a webinar on the fun peace process role of spoilers, which is being organized by IPRI tomorrow. That is the 8th of October. The registration link for the webinar can be found on IPRI's social media platforms. And upon registering, you will receive a confirmation email with the webinar link and password. I thank you all for your active participation today. Allah Hafiz.
Thank you.